Vietnam and Indonesia are set to legalize the boundaries of each other's exclusive economic zones. It's hoped this will put an end to an often bitter dispute involving their overlapping waters. The South China Sea neighbours also elevated their strategic partnership to the highest level, signalling much closer cooperation. It came as Vietnamese leader To Lam also inked a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US, security partner Singapore. And in February, he signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with New Zealand, making it 3 upgrades at the highest level so far in 2025. Does this change the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific, and what are the consequences for China? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yi Kavat. Joining us today are Yuan I, National Chengchi University Institute of International Relations Adjunct Research Fellow, and Brian Hioe, New Bloom magazine founding editor. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Vietnam General Secretary To Lam visited Indonesia in early March, with a return visit expected by Prabowo Subianto to Hanoi in April. Both sides are set to finally ratify the agreement struck in December 2022 to demarcate their overlapping EEZ after more than a decade of negotiations. Vietnam and Indonesia also agreed to deepen existing military cooperation, including joint military exercises and joint patrols. Professor Yuan, let me come to you first. So after 15 years, essentially, how historic is this agreement and then the ratification?
It is indeed a very, very welcome sign gesture after decades of negotiation in typical ASEAN way. Such a important message being transcended to the region partner in particular, and also to the outside audience. To what extent would prolong to have generate a prolonged impact? I think all in all, it demonstrated that the bilateral negotiation could be settled to foster a coalitions amongst the competing parties in this regard. So this is that's
a very important point. Let me bring in Brian. Brian, so what we're saying there is this bilateral cooperation. I think what Professor is saying is that this can then provide a united front, especially if we were to pull in more of the claimants against China.
Yeah, I think ASEAN is now particularly nervous because of these large shifts that are afoot in the world regarding U.S. power, but also how China will react. And regarding the South China Seas or other potential territorial disputes, it is interesting to see these two parties now setting aside historic differences. ASEAN is, of course, within itself very much contested, and the framing is often criticized as toothless. But it's to be seen if, for example, just these two nations now engaging with each other one by one, having come to this finally, will there actually be some progress, or will there be a setting aside of historical enmities in some ways?
Right. So what you're saying is it could set a precedent. And it is interesting that they are taking a leaf out of China's own book. China likes to deal with countries on a bilateral basis rather than ASEAN as a whole.
I think this is for the first time the ASEAN member come to grips with the centrality of the issue being settled amongst themselves. I think it's a prolonged, very agonizing to watch this process slow, very, very unpleasant record. I would point out, I think the very timing has to do with the political leadership change. Mm-hmm. All the people, important people, emergence on the surface now are the new leaders. I think it is for timing-wise, those are new leaders were very much to exert impact, okay, for the political well-being of their own respective nation.
And what do you make, Professor, of the double-barreled, not just the ratification of the demarcation of their EEZs, but also that comprehensive strategic partnership on top of that, signaling much closer, tighter cooperation?
I think this is a gesture on a bilateral basis. I think to foster a more relatively cozy working relation with one another on the issue, never being settled in such a formalistic fashions. So this will pave way for to avert the past practice to creating a new alternative path to settle issues for the future.
And Brian, of course, part of a comprehensive strategic partnership is the security, defense side of things. Do you think that we will see more, joint military exercises, joint patrols, basically as a show of force to China, or will these two nations perhaps not want to provoke China?
It's a good question, particularly the comprehensive strategic partnerships, along with these strategic partnerships that Vietnam likes to use as a label for some of its diplomatic relations, are somewhat ill-defined, but then it does mean this upgrading of relations. I think particularly what's interesting is that Prabowo, even before he was sworn into office as someone who is relatively new in office, but of course has been part of Indonesia's military establishment for quite a long time, signaled the importance of the ties with Vietnam by conducting meetings ahead of time and signaling this to the world. And so I think there is a priority here in terms of outreach. I also think it dovetails with his own domestic priorities, for example, in expanding the role of the military.
On February 27th, Vietnam and New Zealand announced an upgrading of their strategic partnership to the highest level. The joint statement identified 5 areas for deepened cooperation, including political engagement and defense security, and oceans topping the list. In particular, the two sides noted the obligation of all states to adhere to international law. The two sides expressed deep concern over developments in the South China Sea and called on all parties to exercise self-restraint, avoid actions which escalate tensions or erode trust, and to resolve disputes without resorting to threat or the use of force in accordance with UNCLOS. Brian, so both countries in February, were subject to China announcing live fire drills, or so-called live fire drills, close to their waters, and this was within 2 weeks. Now, New Zealand and Australia were given no notice, but I understand that Vietnam were. How do you think that this now, comprehensive strategic partnership will enable these two countries to work together to stand up to China's sort of expansionist claims, assertiveness?
Yeah, it's a very good question with Vietnam, because Vietnam has historically tried to avoid entanglements in one political camp or another in terms of the competition geopolitically in the region. That's true also, for example, of Indonesia, which is claimed to be non-aligned in the sense. And so I think that we are seeing this shared priority between different countries in the region, including New Zealand, to not be caught in this competition, and that may push them towards regional cooperation. And so I think that is noteworthy. It's to be seen if something more substantive can come out of that. And Vietnam historically has had closer relations with China. It is a nominally socialist country, although one notes that the last war China fought was in fact with Vietnam 40 years ago. And so I think it's quite interesting to observe this relation at present, and also how Vietnam seeks to navigate this, particularly again with other regional powers are feeling a sense of pressure right now at this time of instability.
And for you, Brian, does it alter the balance of power at all in the Pacific? I mean, this, we're not just talking about the South China Sea or even just this East China Sea. Now we're talking about the Pacific in terms of these partnerships between more like-minded states.
It's a really good question. I think that really does depend on the larger regional shifts. Again, Prabowo is new in office, and so will be seeking to cement his brand politically in the region. I think also particularly in the Philippines, there's still, for example, questions with Marcos versus Duterte and that kind of thing. So I think a lot about the region is uncertain. It depends on the domestic dynamics there. But New Zealand, I think in particular, as part of, for example, more historically close to Australia, also the US, and so forth, I think there's bound to be more caution there. So it might also be the odd one out in that sense.
Now, according to Vietnam scholar Hai Nguyen Hong, Vietnam conceives their strategic partnerships and comprehensive strategic partnerships as frameworks that operate through this model. First, each other's strategic interests. Second, strategic dialogues and cooperation to build trust. And the last one, fifth, peaceful dispute and conflict resolution. Professor Yuan, let me ask you, bearing those in mind, why do you think that Vietnam chose New Zealand to be its 9th comprehensive strategic partner?
I think again, I have some, different perspective on this. I think timing-wise, this year marks the 50th anniversary of a diplomatic relation between New Zealand and Vietnam. So I noticed 2009, both countries signed a comprehensive agreement, and 2020, they sign a strategic partner. Okay, so it sounds to me a very rhetorical expression of the ongoing, evolving relation for one way or the other. So
you believe that it's just matured, a relationship that is matured?
More something rhetorical. And also, I have a slightly different take on this New Zealand's position on that. I think the New Zealand versus Vietnam on the South China Sea issue has a profound differences. I think the signal transcended by Beijing, PLA's military adjacent to the New Zealand, Australia, simply addressed to the issue, stay away from the Taiwan issue. Should crisis occurred, the China sent a very strong signal. If you will not honor that principle, I will do the very hostile action as what China has already demonstrated. They could exercise a military drill without prior notification. But in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam still stick to the one China principle. So I think that there's a profound difference between the two countries in regarding to the one China principle. So for this pact still signify an effort to coordinate it on the regional security issue and also on creating more multilateral framework to coping with the security issue at large.
So just to go back to your point that you believe it's rhetorical or it's simple, the elevation to the highest level is without substance? Is that what you're saying?
I think the Vietnam has carried out very, very cautiously by not overtly be provocative. Okay, let me repeat, not to overtly provocative, to avoid antagonize China. All right, so we have to discern the very subtle line of the Vietnamese line of reasoning.
Okay, so Brian, on that point, I think we know historically that Vietnam does take that position. It has a very strong desire not to provoke China. Perhaps of late, we are seeing maybe things bubbling to the surface because of China's, repeated assertiveness in the South China Sea. But do you see this as Professor did, that it's simply just a 50-year-old relationship that is judged to be matured and therefore it's gone up to the highest level? Or do you think that there was, especially looking at that framework that we read through, are there specific reasons perhaps to reach out to New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, New Zealand is considered a Western country in that sense, even though it's part of the Pacific, but then it is not drawn into these geopolitical disputes regarding, for example, the South China Seas or regional militarization as easily. One also notes that Vietnam has the threat of China that has been there historically, whereas Vietnam has not, and it is, of course, at much more of a distance. I think what is interesting to note is that the leadership of China and the PLA, as well as in regards to the political leadership in Vietnam and military leadership, they remember when a war was fought 40 years ago. Those were individuals that were in their 20s and 30s then who are now at the higher levels. And so I do think that there is this memory there institutionally that may be impacting decision-making.
So as in that they harbor a form of resentment is what you seem to be saying?
Or still are cautious of the threat because of the fact that there was this conflict about 45 years ago now.
Right, okay. Following To Lam's visit to Indonesia, he proceeded to Singapore, where both sides pledged to enhance mutual cooperation in defense, cybersecurity and law enforcement. The South China Sea was discussed along with a $150 million subsea cable project between the two countries as part of Vietnam's ambitious 10 cable plan. Professor Yuan, let me come to you. So we know that in 2024, the Biden administration did actually make attempts to persuade or dissuade Vietnam from cooperating with Chinese cable companies. That their fear was that there, was the possibility for espionage, cable espionage, and also sabotage, which of course Taiwan has had a good taste of recently. and on an ongoing basis. And that's not only of Hanoi, but of course of American companies based in Vietnam. So did you read this in that context? Can we read it in the context, the announcement with Singapore?
Well, that move suggests the modification or change, if not totally, changes of the Vietnamese attitude on this. According to the report, that the such move would strengthen what would demonstrate Vietnam's typical strategic hedging policy. That is balancing between major power to maintain economic and security benefit while maintaining autonomy, right?
Their sort of bamboo policy.
It is typical. And yet choosing Singapore to the benefit, they could just reap the maximum benefit from aligning to a neutral, relatively Singapore.
So you do believe that the US was an influence in that decision?
Well, I hope so. Okay, so the strategic choices of Vietnam's move in this regard simply to offer something for our our understanding of the Vietnamese practice of this hedging policy.
And Brian, I mean, if this was successful, this one project, this one cable, do you believe that that partnership could be expanded to perhaps more of those 10 that we know that Vietnam wants to build?
Yeah, it is interesting. Vietnam, for example, wants to build itself up as a data center and a digital hub in that sense. And I think that regionally we see a lot of this desire, particularly for data centers now, which require infrastructure such as cables, but also power. And in this sense, Vietnam is trying to counterbalance and hedge bets by diversifying infrastructure, also military ties as well. And so I think this is also dovetails with Singapore also attempts to do and has attempted to do historically, including between the US and China, maybe between Taiwan and China. For example, that the Singaporean military trains in Taiwan, for example, rather than China. And so their interests in this sense coincide.
And Brian, let me ask you, because in 2024, Singapore was Vietnam's largest foreign investment. I believe it was just over $10 billion. What is it that makes Vietnam for Singapore such a good investment?
Yeah, I think there's a desire in terms of Singapore, particularly because of its status of a financial hub, but then there is also much Chinese capital that passes through Singapore, so it is also a way station. So it's not always easy to disentangle, but I think there are still high hopes on the Chinese market. And if Singapore hopes to position itself as a player in between, as a way to reach to other markets, I think basically both sides may see it as a win-win relation in that sense.
That's interesting, Professor Yuan, because my next question was going to be, can Singapore, in essence, help Vietnam reduce Hanoi's dependency on China? But with that relationship that Brian has set up, it appears to be a lot more complex.
I think according to the record, that the bilateral trade between China and Vietnam still is very outstanding. So the FDI
largest trading partner.
It is. There's no escape for Vietnam to maintain that. That is not be forgotten. The high-level visit has been completed last year. The current leadership has reciprocally visit their respective capitals. They also issue a joint statement. It's very comprehensive. As we talk about the current status of Vietnam's move toward the various neighbors, let us not be forgotten. The major pillar to propel the Vietnamese development has to do with the very structural elements. So the question I would ask myself is whether to what degree that the agency, the Vietnam as a middle power could exert agency versus the structural forces being determined by major power. So on each step, we could get some answer to the big question.
Right. So Brian, do you want to take a go at answering that question. To what extent does Vietnam have that agency? I mean, another way to express that is, you know, is it deliberately hedging against both the US and China?
Yeah, I think this is the question that every country in the region is basically asking of themselves now. Well, what do we do now? And so in that sense, that actually is pushing the region closer together. I do see more room for cooperation between countries that see themselves as wedged between larger superpowers in a sense. And that does include Vietnam, of course. But of course, the needs of different countries and their strategic priorities differ based on geography, what are actual threats, what are their economic ties. And so I think it does vary. And so I think there is, it'll be interesting to see how relations between countries in the region pan out going forward.
Professor Yuan, and so we know that in 2024, Vietnam had a trade surplus with the US of 100 billion. It's one of the highest out of all the countries. And so as a result, like many other countries, it's recently struck deals with President Trump that include to buy more American LNG and actually also to partner on critical minerals. What kind of a impact do you think it would have on China for Vietnam to have the significant high tariffs if they were to still come into place?
There are various levels involved on those bilateral trade negotiation. So the current administration of the United States, Donald Trump, you know, since his inauguration, has already sent a very strong signal to all the capitals. I think the capitals involved, the leaders would have to come out with their respective strategy dealing with this surplus. So in one way or the other, they have to, you know, convert cash their bills in such a way to paper over the potential pitfall it might come out. So Vietnam has demonstrated as a middle power, they are able to coping with this external threat and pretty well in the past. So also being a post-colonial state, I think the Vietnam, when we're talking about Vietnam, it involves multiple identities. So would be very dynamic, will be very, very interesting to follow. So all in all, I think the Vietnam would do something to keep balance for the benefit of its national interest.
Brian, one final question. So we started the show with the three the upgrades to the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership for Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, and also New Zealand. How do you think that places Vietnam in the region in terms of that diplomatic outreach?
Yeah, it depends. I think particularly now, for example, we do see the Trump administration turning pressure on some countries that are closer to China, for example, Laos and Cambodia, by blocking travel from these places. And so I think Vietnam is also conscious of the optics of being too closely associated with China, as well as how that impacts its ability to strengthen relations with other countries in the region. Again, as I mentioned, their historical relationships to either the US or China differ. And so I think Vietnam is actually perhaps wanting to manage the optics of being too closely associated with China, and at the same time perhaps fly under the US radar, because I do question where Donald Trump, if he knows where Vietnam is, but if he notices that the trade deficit is high, he may suddenly turn the pressure on Vietnam out of nowhere, as we see with arm twisting against Ukraine or even Canada and Greenland and all these other places.
That will have to be the last word. Thank you so much, Yuan I and Brian Hioe, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.